June 24, 1944, Nordhausen, Thuringia, Germany. The assembly hangar at Nordhausen smelled of aviation fuel and cold metal when Oberleutnant Werner Dörnbrack first saw the composite aircraft that would become known as Mistel S1, a Junkers Ju-88A4 bomber stripped of its crew compartment and packed with 3,800 kilograms of hollow charge explosive fitted beneath a Messerschmitt Bf-109 F4 fighter. The two machines, joined by a trio of steel struts and electrical couplings that transformed them into a single piloted weapon system designed to penetrate the heaviest naval armor or concrete fortifications that conventional bombing had failed to destroy. Dörnbrack had flown 112 combat sorties over the Eastern Front before his transfer to Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Wing, tasked with testing experimental weapons that occupied the boundary between desperation and innovation. And he understood immediately that the Mistel represented both the ingenuity and the exhaustion of a military machine that had been grinding itself against superior Allied production for 4 years without respite. The Ju-88's nose had been replaced with a massive warhead shaped like an elongated cone, its copper lining designed to form a superheated jet of metal upon detonation that could theoretically burn through 4 meters of reinforced concrete or the armored deck of a battleship, while the Bf-109 mounted above served as the piloting component that would guide the unmanned bomber to its target before separating at the final moment and allowing the explosive-laden aircraft to complete its terminal dive under its own momentum. The test program had begun in secrecy at Nordhausen under the designation Beethoven-Gerät before being renamed Mistel, mistletoe, for the parasitic way the fighter clung to the bomber's back. And Dörnbrack spent the next 3 weeks learning the peculiar flight characteristics of the combined aircraft, which handled like an overloaded transport during takeoff and required constant trim adjustments to compensate for the asymmetric thrust and the dead weight of the unmanned lower component. The control system linking the two aircraft consisted of a series of cables and electrical connections that allowed the Bf-109 pilot to manage the Ju-88's throttle, rudder, and elevator surfaces while both machines remained joined, and Dörnbrack practiced separation procedures over the pine forests of Thuringia, pulling the emergency release at 2,000 meters and feeling the sudden lightness as the fighter broke free and the pilotless bomber continued forward in a shallow dive, its empty cockpit pointing toward the target coordinates that had been set before takeoff. By mid-July, he had completed 14 training flights and witnessed 2 catastrophic failures, one when the struts collapsed during takeoff, sending both aircraft cartwheeling across the runway in a cascade of sparks and burning fuel that killed the pilot instantly, and another when the separation mechanism malfunctioned at altitude, forcing the pilot to bail out while the locked-together aircraft spiraled into a meadow and detonated with a concussion that shattered windows in a village 8 kilometers away. The program continued despite these losses because Reichsmarschall Göring had personally ordered the development of weapons capable of striking at the Allied invasion fleet that had landed in Normandy 6 weeks earlier, and the Mistel offered a theoretical solution to the problem of delivering massive explosive payloads against hardened targets without requiring the crew to fly directly into the overwhelming anti-aircraft fire that had been decimating conventional bomber formations since D-Day. Dörnbrack understood that he and the other pilots of KG-200 2nd Staffel were being trained for a mission that would likely be announced with minimal warning, probably targeting either the British home fleet anchorages at Scapa Flow or the concrete U-boat pens along the French Atlantic coast that Allied bombing had failed to penetrate. And he spent his evenings in the officers' quarters studying reconnaissance photographs of both target areas, memorizing the approaches, the known flak positions, the patrol patterns of British night fighters, and the elevation profiles that would be necessary for a successful attack run. The summer nights were short that far north,
and the airfield operated under strict blackout conditions, with only hooded lamps marking the taxiways. But Dörnbrack could hear the constant drone of Allied bombers passing overhead on their way to targets deeper in the Reich, their formations so large and so frequent that the air raid sirens had stopped sounding, except when the Pathfinder aircraft dropped their marker flares, and the local population knew that tonight Nordhausen itself might burn beneath the carpet of incendiaries and high explosives that had already reduced Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin to landscapes of rubble and ash.
August 19, 1944, Grove, Denmark. The forward operating base at Grove consisted of a single concrete runway, 6 camouflaged revetments, a wooden control tower, and a dozen canvas tents that housed the maintenance crews and pilots of II/KG-200, who had been ordered north from Nordhausen with 12 Mistel combinations under conditions of absolute radio silence following the breakdown of German forces in Normandy and the growing certainty that the war in the West was entering its terminal phase. Oberleutnant Dörnbrack and his fellow pilots received their final briefing at 0340 hours on a morning when fog rolled in from the North Sea and reduced visibility to less than 200 meters. The operations officer spreading his maps across a table illuminated by a single kerosene lamp and tracing the flight path that would take them northeast across the Skagerrak, then south along the Norwegian coast before turning west toward Scapa Flow, where British reconnaissance had confirmed the presence of at least 3 capital ships, the battleship HMS Duke of York, the aircraft carrier HMS Furious, and the battlecruiser HMS Renown, anchored behind anti-torpedo nets and protected by more than 80 anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the harbor perimeter. The attack plan called for the Mistel formations to approach at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, then climb to 3,000 meters at the last possible moment, give the Ju-88 components their final heading corrections, separate, and allow the unmanned bombers to dive toward their targets while the Bf-109 pilots escaped at full throttle, relying on darkness and surprise to evade the inevitable fighter response. Dörnbrack's assigned target was Duke of York, a King George V-class battleship displacing 42,000 tons and armored with 380 millimeters of steel across her main belt, and he had studied every available photograph of the vessel until he could visualize her exact profile: the distinctive quadruple turrets forward and aft, the massive bridge structure, the forest of anti-aircraft guns that bristled from every deck, and he knew that even if his Mistel struck home, there was no guarantee that the shape-charged warhead would penetrate deep enough to reach the magazines or engineering spaces, where a detonation might prove fatal to the ship. Takeoff was scheduled for 0445 hours, but was delayed twice by the fog, which refused to lift despite the promises of the meteorological officer, and it was nearly 0600 before Dörnbrack's Mistel combination finally lurched down the runway, the Ju-88's engine straining under the weight of the explosive payload, while the Bf-109's propeller clawed at the dense air, the whole ungainly assembly barely clearing the trees at the far end of the field and requiring nearly 10 minutes to climb to operational altitude. The formation of 12 Mistels had been reduced to 9 by maintenance problems and 1 runway collision that killed both the pilot and 3 ground crew, and the survivors flew in a loose gaggle rather than a proper formation, each pilot concentrating on keeping his composite aircraft stable while navigating by compass bearing across water that stretched gray and featureless in every direction beneath a sky that gradually brightened from black to slate as dawn approached. They crossed into Norwegian airspace at 0715 hours, flying at 150 meters above the wavetops with their throttles advanced to maximum continuous power, the engines roaring in synchronization and vibrating the airframes until Dörnbrack's hands went numb from gripping the control column, his eyes scanning constantly for British patrol boats or long-range bow fighters that prowled these waters hunting for German reconnaissance aircraft and torpedo bombers. At 0803 hours, the formation leader radioed a single code word, WOTAN,
indicating that he had identified the turning point where they would begin their final approach toward Scapa Flow. But as the aircraft banked west, Dörnbrack saw 3 Mistels peel away from the formation, their pilots evidently experiencing mechanical failures or losing their nerve, and then they were over open ocean again, with no land in sight and nothing but fuel calculations and compass headings to guide them toward a target that lay somewhere beyond the northwestern horizon. The British detected them at 08:27 hours, exactly 17 minutes before the planned separation point, when a radar station on Hoy picked up the formation and scrambled 6 Spitfire Mark 9s from RAF Kirkwall, and Dörnbrack heard the warning over his radio, Indianer, Indianer, the code for enemy fighters, followed by the operations officer's voice ordering immediate separation and every pilot for himself. Dörnbrack had rehearsed this moment 20 times in training, but never under combat conditions, with British fighters diving toward him and his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold, and the certain knowledge that he was too far from friendly territory to have any hope of survival if his engine failed or if he took even minor damage to any critical system. He armed the Ju-88's autopilot, set the final heading by reference to the chart strapped to his knee, pulled the electrical disconnect, released the mechanical locks, and felt the Bf-109 leap upward as the 3 struts blew free with small explosive charges, and the bomber beneath him continued forward on his programmed course toward a target that Dörnbrack could not see and would never know whether it reached.
April 25, 1945. Rechlin, Mecklenburg, Germany. The Airprobungsstelle at Rechlin had become a repository of failed ambitions by the time Oberleutnant Werner Dörnbrack returned from the Eastern Front, where he had spent the winter flying conventional Bf-109s against Soviet ground attack aircraft over the collapsing remnants of Army Group Vistula. And the test station's hangars now held dozens of abandoned aircraft types that represented the Luftwaffe's desperate attempts to reverse a war that everyone except the most deluded staff officers understood was already lost beyond redemption. Dörnbrack had survived Scapa Flow by pure chance. His Bf-109 had taken 3 hits from a Spitfire's cannons that destroyed his radio and punctured a fuel tank, but left the engine functional enough to limp back across the North Sea and crash land on a beach near Esbjerg. And he had spent 6 weeks recovering from a fractured collarbone before being reassigned to Jagdgeschwader 52. But now, in the final weeks of the war, he had been recalled to Rechlin as part of a skeletal cadre tasked with evacuating whatever equipment and documentation could be saved before the advancing Red Army overran the facility. Among the aircraft awaiting destruction or capture were 17 Mistel combinations of various marks, including the newer S2 version that paired a Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter with a U-88 bomber, and the S3 series that used a U-88 G1 night fighter as the lower component, all of them fueled and armed and theoretically ready for operations that would never occur because there were no strategic targets remaining within range and no fuel reserves sufficient to mount more than token missions against enemies who controlled the air completely and absolutely. The operations staff of KG-200 had attempted 2 additional Mistel attacks after Scapa Flow, one against bridges over the Vistula River in January 1945 that achieved several hits but failed to collapse the structures, and another against Soviet armor concentrations near Kustrin in March that resulted in the loss of 5 aircraft without confirmed kills. And these failures, combined with the collapse of fuel production and the disintegration of the Reich's air defense system, had effectively ended the program, except as a subject for historical record and post-war technical evaluation. Dörnbrack had been ordered to prepare a comprehensive after-action report on the Mistel program for whoever might eventually care to read it, and he spent his days in a freezing office typing on a requisitioned typewriter while artillery rumbled in the east and columns of refugees streamed past the airfield gates heading west toward the imagined safety of American rather than Soviet occupation. His report noted that approximately 250 Mistel combinations had been produced between 1943 and 1945, that fewer than 100 had been committed to combat operations, that confirmed successful strikes against meaningful targets numbered less than a dozen, and that the fundamental concept, using an unmanned, explosive-laden aircraft as a precision-guided weapon, had proven valid in theory but impossible to execute effectively, given the Luftwaffe's deteriorating operational situation and the overwhelming Allied air superiority that made survival of the piloting component an increasingly remote possibility. On April 28, 3 days after he completed his report, Dörnbrack received orders to fly one of the remaining Mistels on a final mission against Soviet troops approaching from the east, not because anyone believed it would affect the outcome, but because the commanding general refused to surrender operational aircraft to the enemy intact, and Dörnbrack, along with 4 other pilots, took off at dawn on a morning when smoke from burning supply dumps obscured the sun, and flew east at treetop level until they spotted a column of T-34 tanks advancing along a road cratered by previous air attacks. Dörnbrack armed his U-88 component, set the autopilot for a 40-degree dive, and separated at 1,000 meters, then pulled into a climbing turn and watched as the unmanned bomber plunged toward the tank column and detonated with a flash that momentarily whited out his vision, followed by a pillar of black smoke that rose 200 meters before being shredded by the wind. But whether he had destroyed any tanks or merely created another crater in the already devastated landscape, he could not determine, and it no longer seemed important, because the war was over in everything but name, and he was flying on fumes toward an airfield that might already be overrun, his thoughts occupied not with victory or defeat, but with the purely practical question of where he would land and what he would say when the soldiers, whether German, Soviet, or American, finally stopped him and asked him to explain what he had been doing in the sky above a continent that was burning itself to ash beneath him.